More people are going to land their dream wildlife job in the next few years than they have in all of human history. If you do what other wildlife professionals do, you eventually get the same result. Here at the Practical Animal channel, I interview wildlifers to document this rise to success and their career roadmap. Then I broadcast that path to you through my videos. Watch this video for an excellent summary of what it takes to be a project manager working to eradicate an introduced pest from a seabird island. So, if career success for you means working on pest eradication from island ecosystems, how do you get there? Dr. Anton Wolfaardt has worked for 3 decades in seabird and marine conservation, a journey which started on Marion Island. There he worked as a seabird field researcher. Then it was on to Dasson Island, first in research and later as the conservation manager of the island. After leaving Dasson, Anton worked as an ecologist for Cape Nature. In 2008, Anton headed to the Falkland Islands as coordinator for the agreement on the conservation of albatross and petrels for British South Atlantic overseas territories. This included fieldwork in South Georgia, Tristan da Cunha, and other British South Atlantic overseas territories. After returning to South Africa, Anton served as the co-convener of the Seabird Bycatch Working Group and worked as an environmental consultant on seabird issues, as well as a lecturer and guide on expedition ships visiting the Antarctic and sub-Antarctic. In February 2021, Anton was appointed Mouse-Free Marion Project Manager. If you're learning English as a second language, this video will be useful because you will hear 2 accents, a British and a South African one. And before we go any further, I would like to say thank you to my subscribers. Without you, there would be no channel. Working in seabird ecology and living the wildlife looks like this. Anton, what do you do?
John, I have the privilege of being the project manager for the Mouse-Free Marion project. It's an initiative to eradicate invasive house mice on Marion Island to achieve a really important conservation outcome. It's an ecological restoration project, which I'm sure we'll talk a bit about in this interview. And as project manager, I am overall responsible for coordinating the planning and preparation for this initiative, which is an initiative which requires many years of planning in order to achieve a situation where we maximize our chance of a successful outcome. So I oversee everything from the research to stakeholder engagement to the regulatory approvals that we require to fundraising, the science partnerships. And I think the important thing to say is that it really is an interdisciplinary initiative which spans conservation, biology, field research, toxicology, risk assessment, lots of complex logistics, and importantly, communications. So it's an exciting project with lots of moving parts, lots of components, and as I mentioned, I have the honor of being the project manager.
That sounds fantastic. Anton, how did your career develop?
It actually started on Marion Island about 30 years ago now. I was coming out of my undergrad in zoology and environmental science, and I saw an advert in the zoology department for an opportunity to spend a year on a subantarctic island. It wasn't something I'd planned to do. I was actually intending to continue with my honors degree, but I then went and spoke to the person who had put the advert up, and I was intrigued by this island and the opportunity of spending a year there. I was lucky enough to get that position, which was to study seabirds for a year on this remarkable, wild, incredible island, Marion Island, and that got me hooked. And essentially, ever since then, my career has focused on island ecosystems and seabirds. And in that time, I've done I've been engaged with a number of NGOs, government departments, international agreements. And over time, I suppose my experience has been focused on the gap between science and management. And it's something that I'm really fascinated by. I have a PhD, so I've done quite a lot of research, but I've never really been involved for long periods of time in academia. I'm particularly excited by that gap between knowing and doing, and being at the interface of that gap. And so this project provides an opportunity to be involved in that kind of work again. There's a lot of research involved. There's application of various kind of initiatives. There's policy. There's regulatory environments. There's ethical issues, etc. So yeah, in many ways, I feel like becoming involved in this project is appropriate. My career started off on Marion Island, and I now have the opportunity to give back in an incredible conservation project, which has the ability to achieve a legacy which is very rare in the kind of legacy which is very rare in conservation initiatives.
What skills do you need to do what you do and manage an undertaking like the mouse-free Marion project?
John, so this is a particularly large-scale, complex project, and I would say that you need a mix of skills. You need a mix of strategic planning, ecological knowledge, risk assessment and risk management, logistics, and stakeholder diplomacy. I think one of the things which often one doesn't kind of acquire experience with at university, although there are specialist courses, is communication, not just to peers and to colleagues, but to a wider audience, which might include people from other sectors, the general public. I really think communication skills are critical, and also the ability to juggle multiple moving parts while keeping sight of the broader conservation mission which you are busy pursuing. I think it also helps to be resilient. These projects are challenging and complex and not always easy. There are always solutions. You've just got to, carry on persisting to find your way over and around obstacles that are inevitable. So I would say a range of those kinds of skills and a good people's person, because, as I said, these kinds of projects are interdisciplinary, not only within the science and conservation and kind of animal management sphere, but I really believe that conservation is mostly about people. Often we know the issues around threats and we think we know how best to manage them from a scientific perspective. But I think the challenge often comes about in terms of how to implement those solutions and to get people on board, whether it's policy, whether it's communities, whether it's just individual landowners. And that's often quite tricky. And often those of us that come from a biological science background might not necessarily have the skills to understand how to engage with people, to change ways of thinking, to change attitudes, to change human behavior. We kind of come from a perspective where we know what the solution is, and we often get frustrated that it isn't being implemented. And we often don't know how best to engage with the kind of target audiences to try and incrementally nudge people in the direction that we think is appropriate. So I would say those are all skills that, as a conservationist, not only in a project like this, but in most conservation initiatives, one needs to achieve success.
Mm, mm, mm. Anton, for somebody who's watched the first few minutes of this and is already totally inspired, what field should they be looking at? Should it be pest control? Should it be conservation biology? What should they be looking to specialize in?
I don't think it necessarily matters, John. As I said earlier, I came at this from a seabird and island conservation perspective. I had some relatively minor involvement in some pest control management eradication projects when I was based in the Falkland Islands. But I didn't study to become an eradication practitioner. I studied to get involved in conservation. And I think there are opportunities to specialize. So obviously, if there are courses where you can focus on that, that's great. But if I just think of our team, for example, there are people that come from a wide range of backgrounds, mostly from conservation, from zoology, um, some of whom have developed a lot of experience over the last decade or more in island eradication projects. But I think that my sense is that conservation is quite a wide-ranging kind of discipline, and I think that getting a broad experience in conservation is actually quite helpful. It's not to say that specializing isn't helpful. I mean, if you are if you're already aware that you want to focus in on something, that's great. But I think often these conservation projects need both specialists and generalists. And I think my suggestion to people that are thinking of getting into the field is to get involved in projects, either through internships or to volunteer with NGOs or government bodies to get a feel for these kinds of initiatives and to see what areas you would like to get involved in. There are so many different components which form part of these. So you could be a broad project manager type person, or you could be somebody who's very focused on the research and modeling impacts of invasive species on island systems. That would require a specific kind of focus in terms of your studies. Or you could be somebody who develops skills in geographical information systems, for example. And that's a tool and a technique which we use for these kinds of projects, GIS. And so if you develop those skills and then are brought into a project like this as part of the team, it's useful that you've got a broad understanding of invasive species management and then how your GIS skills and those tools can be brought into that. And then, of course, in these large scale projects like I'm involved in, there are other skills that are needed, such as helicopter pilots, logistics experts, and those people come at it from a different kind of background. They wouldn't necessarily have studied conservation or zoology or kind of pest management, but perhaps they've developed skills, additional skills that complement their primary skills. So myself, I came at it from a seabird and island conservation perspective. Colleagues of mine who are involved in this work have come at it from a botanical perspective or from just, working on islands. So I don't think there's any one route for people. I think from my own personal perspective, I think the broad overview and understanding of these things is very useful. And then honing in on initiatives and kind of projects that you think will be of interest to you.
You've already alluded to it, Anton, I think, but what skills do aspiring wildlife biologists uh, sometimes lack?
I think most people that come from a university degree in zoology and conservation, environmental science have strong fieldwork and ecological theory. And I'm generalizing now, just thinking of my own experience, but often lack skills in some of these other things which you might not even think about, such as project management, fundraising, communication, as I said earlier, is incredibly important. Engaging with the general public, engaging with other sectors of society, and systems thinking. I think experience in for these kinds of projects in regulatory compliance and stakeholder engagement often also is missing, but essential for work on these large-scale conservation initiatives. Often again, we have an approach, we have a strategy in terms of kind of how we're going to proceed with these kinds of projects. But one has to navigate quite complex regulatory environments, and one has to engage with public around issues which potentially are seen as controversial by some. And I think that requires a range of other skills. And sometimes you can have those specialist skills as part of your team. But if you are a small team like we are, with a few individuals who are involved in all aspects of it, it's very useful to have acquired those skills as well. And I think it comes back to what I mentioned earlier, is that conservation in many respects, in most respects, I'd argue, is about people. It's about convincing people, working with people to implement actions which are important to achieve conservation outcomes. And often it's easier said than done. In many respects, and I'm not downplaying the importance of the science and the research. I've come from a research background. In many respects, the research is the easy part. You conduct the research, you come up with recommendations, you hope that somehow those recommendations are going to be implemented. It very rarely happens passively. One, there needs to be a process of engaging, of facilitating that bridge between the knowing and the doing. And I think that requires a whole range of additional skills, which aren't necessarily the core of an undergraduate degree that one would take at university. I mean, there are courses offered in, science communication and project management, and I think these are important because it's those kind of skills that help facilitate bridging that gap between the science and the implementation.
Do you need a degree to do this? And if so, is a first degree, a bachelor's, sufficient? Or do people need a master's degree or even a PhD?
John, I think a degree in a BSc can certainly open the door, especially if it's combined with strong field experience. And perhaps for more strategic or specialized role, and as I was talking about earlier, sort of modeling of ecological impacts, often an MSc might be required or even a PhD. I mean, not required, but would be useful. But I do think that more important than a degree is practical experience and the ability to work in these multidisciplinary teams. So I'd really encourage those that are interested in getting into these fields to use every opportunity available to get involved as a volunteer, as an intern in a range of different projects, because acquired experience through that involvement is incredibly valuable and certainly complements the degree. So I would say, again, thinking about my own team, um, I think everybody has a BSc or equivalent degree. Others have a range of different postgraduate degrees from honors through to PhD. But those certainly, when we were looking to recruit key people, weren't requirements. We were looking more for the right person for the right role and how they could fit in to our small team, the kind of practical experience that they brought to the team and to the project. So it's very much a horses for courses thing, and I would really emphasize the importance of practical experience, and you can get that from from early on. You don't have to wait until you finish your degree. I've been really impressed with youngsters who've even during their school days have in their holidays gone out and volunteered and got experience in projects because they're passionate about that work, and I think that's another thing that shines through in my experience is it's not just the qualifications and the experience that you can list on your CV. When you're engaging with somebody and you can tell from that engagement that they're really passionate about wanting to be involved in that project. That is incredible because a lot of the other skills and experience can be trained. If the passion is there, you know that those people are going to put the effort into learning the technical skills that they need, acquiring the experience. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that, those people that are keen to get in are passionate about it. Don't be deterred by hurdles you might come across, and applications that don't immediately get positive outcomes from. Persist because with passion, I firmly believe you will be able to participate in this field and make very valuable contributions.
Anton, how would you describe rodent eradication or pest control in general in conservation today? Are there many projects that parallel yours around the world?
Absolutely. I mean, maybe the first thing to point out, John, is the difference between eradication and control. Pest management can take on a number of different forms. Obviously, it's done in urban environments, but then it's a very important tool in conservation as well. And our project is focused on an offshore island, an oceanic island, a very large island. Our project is looking at eradication, and the difference between eradication and control is that for eradication, we are looking to get rid of every individual on that island. It often is more practicable on an island than, say, on a large mainland, whereas control is looking at reducing numbers of that pest to a level where that pest population doesn't impose the kind of threats that they would normally do at a much higher level. This has become an incredibly important and effective tool in conservation, especially on islands and especially for seabirds, but not limited to seabirds. And unfortunately, as you and your listeners might know, is that there have been many cases of pests that have been either intentionally or accidentally introduced onto islands. And islands are these biodiversity hotspots, which unfortunately have suffered a much larger number of extinctions per surface area than any equivalent kind of area in the world. And many of those extinctions, the majority of them, are due to introduced pests and especially predators. And so the removal of those pests, those invasive pests that shouldn't be on those islands, has proven to be an incredibly important and effective conservation tool. What it does, it removes probably the most tractable of the threats that these islands face. And we know in conservation that there are never any silver bullets. Most islands and species on islands face a range of threats, and so one needs to address all of those threats. Seabirds on islands, for example, are impacted by climate change, bycatch and fisheries, but importantly, in many cases, due to predation by invasive species. And so, but I would suggest that on islands with seabirds that face threats due to invasive predators, such as mice, rats, and other rodents and introduced mammalian predators, the eradication of those pests comes fairly close to being a silver bullet. It immediately removes forever. It solves that key threat. One needs to make sure that you've got strong biosecurity measures in place to avoid any reintroductions. But once that introduced invasive species kind of has been removed, that problem is solved once and for all. And what that does as well is it also improves the resilience of the species on that island to ongoing and future threats, whether that's disease, climate change, etc. And so we know from hundreds of successful operations that the removal of these invasive predators has a remarkable impact on the biodiversity of those islands. You have this kind of quite rapid rebounding of the impacted species, and the rate at which the different species rebound and recover following the eradication of the species of the invasive species varies according to the life history of the affected species. So for long-lived seabirds, it takes a bit longer. For maybe passerine birds, they can recover quite quickly, as can invertebrates. So and there are many of these initiatives underway at the moment there have been hundreds that have taken place up until now. Ours is quite a high-profile project because of the size of the island. Marion Island is about 30,000 hectares, so it's a particularly large island and logistically very complex.
For somebody with a passion who wants to read around this subject, can you recommend, is there a book or is there a peer-reviewed journal that people can read about this?
I would suggest if they want to go and have a look at our particular project, we have a website, the mousefreemarion.org. There's a lot of information there, not only about our project, but about similar projects. I would also suggest, John, that there is a conference that happens every 5 years called the Island Invasives Conference. There are publications that come out of those conferences that are comprehensive and provide kind of information on a range of projects, not only rodents, but looking at all sorts of invasive species management projects on islands. There is an organization called Island Conservation. If you look up on the website, they're involved in a whole range of invasive species management projects on islands around the world. And so they will also, looking at that website will provide lots of useful information about this kind of work. But the Island Invasives Conference, I can send you afterwards some links to where one can get the proceedings of the various conferences that have taken place. And they, as I say, they're hundreds of pages long with lots of very useful articles about work that is being done around the world. And it's being done in first world countries on large islands, in third world countries on small islands. There's just an incredible range of work that's being undertaken. And it really is an inspiring kind of thing to look at because just, often in conservation, we get quite kind of stressed and kind of depressed about kind of the state of the world. But, this really is something to really inspire our continued efforts because we can achieve wonderful conservation outcomes from these initiatives.
you suggest a research project for a final year student?
Assess the ecological outcomes of a conservation project like this. So, the conservation outcomes for seabirds and other components of the ecosystem of removing invasive species such as mice comes intersect with other pressures that these islands face, such as climate change. Ways of strengthening and improving biosecurity on islands is another kind of area of research that could help. And there's a lot of exciting scope to include technology in a lot of this research. So, in terms of looking at the post-eradication responses and outcomes for seabirds on islands, use of drones and other technology that's developing all the time could be really useful.
Anton, please can you state your full name and occupation and organization for the camera?
My name is Anton Wolfaardt, and I am the project manager for the Mouse-Free Marion project. The project is a collaboration between the South African Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment and an NGO called BirdLife South Africa.
Anton, thank you so much for being on the Practical Animal channel. Dr. Anton Wolfaardt.
Great, thanks, John.